The overwhelming appeal to leave everything behind and venture into nature is a tale as old as time. Actually, maybe not as old as time. It probably began when we gradually started to move away from it. I suppose in a way it can be considered a sort of return, a comeback to what used to be home. This desire often comes with or from a need for solitude, a search for relief and a longing for a simpler way of living, away from chaos, expectations and overall disconnect. Or looking at it from another lens, it can just be an excuse to run away from everything, which doesn't make it sound so inspiring. The thought of just saying, fuck it, I'm leaving, I believe is a thought constantly lingering in the back of the mind of many of us. I would even go ahead and say it's in the back of everyone's mind, but for a certain group of us, it feels a little bit too appealing at times. As someone who was actually born in a cabin in the mountains, whose first steps in this world were watched by sheep, and life lessons taught by nature's raw and firm hand, who then moved to the city to be introduced to real life and social structures, and then, as he grows older, feels this calling deep in himself, that at times feels strong, and other times can hardly be felt. I have at least a bit of insight to tackle this whole sentiment and share what it means to me. For that, I'm going to have to take you to one of those periods in which the pull was at its strongest. December 2024. For most of us, this is a month filled with reflection. You look back at your year, you analyze where you're at. At least for me, it's a very judgmental period on myself, and I don't mean this in a negative way. Reflecting where you're at is really the only path forward. When you see truth, you can't unsee it, and that's the main source of pain. So when you realize you're not where you want to be, you inevitably feel pain, the wish for things to be different from what they are. I don't think it's necessarily a coincidence that when I feel this way, it's often when I'm most compelled to go out in nature. This time I had enough food for me for 3 to 4 days. I had no intention on hiking for long distances like on other occasions. I honestly didn't have the energy for that. I just wanted to get out there and be. No rush, no daily goal to complete other than keeping myself safe in the cold, and it was bitterly cold. I find fascinating how in regards to solitude we all belong to one of two camps. Camp 1 would be those that stay away from solitude, find it unappealing and oddly terrifying. Camp 2 would be those drawn to it like some sort of sanctuary. The funny part is both of them feel the shame for being part of their camp. And those who run of it are aware of their inadequacy and feel constantly at risk for not running fast enough. Those who enjoy it feel strangely guilty as if there was something fundamentally wrong with them. For better or for worse, I'm a not very proud member of Camp 2. I find a lot of peace in solitude. But even though those in Camp 1 often compliment me about what they consider to be a superpower, I just feel like the need for solitude is just evidence that I'm not as capable in other areas of my life. This time of the year is also a moody time of the year in the mountains. Summer, with all of its greenery and filled with visitors, is a very welcoming place, but long gone. By the time before winter snow properly arrives and all the leaves in the trees are gone is when this place feels like, well, exactly how I told you I felt at the start. Almost a shell of itself.
Wow, okay.
I spend the day climbing up valleys where the sun doesn't shine in this time of the year. Eventually, when you get high enough, you crawl out of that slightly sad place, and a few rays of sunlight brighten not only your mood, but also the landscape around you. Even though I was carrying quite a lot of weight on my back, it didn't feel like the only thing I was carrying. This hike wasn't a particularly long or difficult one compared to what I normally throw myself into, but I felt exhausted. I had spent the whole year chasing non-stop, and he had finally caught up with me in the middle of this mountain. I even remember feeling slightly dizzy at this time. But stopping wasn't really an option when in the middle of a climb. I was quite close to where I had planned my shelter anyways. The days were short and I had about 40 minutes of daylight left. As I kept pushing myself up that mountain, I wasn't really alone. Well, I actually was, but let's see how I can explain this without sounding too woo-woo. When I find myself surrounded by beauty, in this case the colors of a winter sunset, I somehow feel comforted in a way. I think Rousseau explains this better in The Solitary Walker, where he writes, "Fleeing from men, seeking solitude, I began to take an interest in everything around me, and a quite natural instinct led me to prefer that which was most pleasing to me. Trees, bushes and plants are the clothing and adornment of the earth. The more sensitive the soul of the observer, the greater the ecstasy aroused in him by this harmony. He loses himself in the immensity of this beautiful order." Yep, that pretty much hits the spot. Anyways, it's always a beautiful sight. I eventually made it to my shelter for the night, a little red cabin surrounded by great peaks, which I had to imagine for the time being, as it was too dark to tell. A cold morning in the mountains. The sun making its timid return to this part of the world. Last night I'd spent my time pondering about the reasons behind my lack of energy. I undoubtedly came to the conclusion that it wasn't physical exhaustion, but more of the emotional kind. Although I can rationalize my way into feeling grateful and blessed for all the good things in my life, it felt, like it always does, just like an intellectual conclusion over an actual feeling. The whole "just be grateful" speech we all try to kidnap ourselves into has yet to have any sort of effect on my mood. It's kinda like when you're a kid and you don't want to eat lunch and you're told that other kids in this world would do anything for that food. Yeah, you know it's true, but it doesn't make you magically like fucking cabbage. Regardless, I felt better that morning. I took all the time in the world to enjoy that place, and by lunchtime I had made it into the next valley. The plan was to find a little cabin in the woods and stay there for a few days. The silence in this place was as mesmerizing as it was slightly creepy. No birds, no human-made noises, hardly any gusts of wind. Just my footsteps rattling the pebbles of what once was a riverbed. That and my loud mouth breathing, thanks to my deviated septum. After many kilometers walking on that flat riverbed, I eventually found a source of water, right where I was going to start my climb, which was extremely convenient. The climb wasn't going to be a long one, but quite steep. The cabin was deep in these valleys, and I knew that, opposite to what had happened the day before, darkness would take over quickly. I could see some light from what was likely another stunning sunset behind the mountains, and with it, the realization I would have to find my way through the forest in the dark. 15th of December, first day in the cabin. Life out in nature is often linked with a relaxing experience, but there's hardly anything relaxing about it. We might be able to make a case about it being calming or peaceful, but definitely not relaxing. You'll arrive quickly to this conclusion when you need water. You've got no tap and the source close to the cabin is dry. So you have to throw your pack on your back and try to find some in the nearby valley. Luckily, it's so quiet you can sometimes listen if there's any water nearby. It's amazing how your senses and intuition make their way back to you in such places. About 2 kilometers away from the cabin, I could finally hear a stream coming out of the mountain. It was far enough for it to be a bit of a pain to come every time water was needed, so I made sure I could collect enough in one go. Loaded with water, I make my way back to the cabin. Surely one can relax now, right? Not really. It's minus 5 degrees Celsius, so you better keep the place warm. And just like that, you got your next task for the morning. Collecting kindling and getting firewood ready to keep the fire going. Not really a relaxing morning by any means, but there's a sense of relief that comes with this, at least for me, when although physically tiring, it's mentally liberating when you've got to complete the most basic of tasks. This in contrast to the endless to-do lists we have grown accustomed to. Henry David Thoreau in his essay Walden, about his own experiment in living in a hut in the woods, writes, "Our life is frittered away by detail. An honest man has hardly need to count more than his 10 fingers, or in extreme cases he may need to add his 10 toes, and lump the rest. Simplicity, I say. Let your affairs be as 2 or 3, and not 100 or 1,000. Instead of 1,000,000, count half a dozen, and keep your accounts on your thumbnail." After that, I made breakfast. Whenever talking about anything cabin and nature related, most of you have probably thought about Into the Wild, the story of Christopher McCandless. Others, in smaller proportion, probably think about Walden, Thoreau's essay on solitude in nature. I must say, as much of a great story as Christopher's is, I find Thoreau's approach a lot more compelling. Even though each person has a different interpretation of that book, to me it has always felt like Christopher's is the story of someone running away in hopes of not dealing with life. Thoreau, on the other hand, takes a lot more of an analytical approach, more of a case study in which he is his own subject, looking for the exact answers we're looking for here. Precisely. Is a cabin in the woods really the answer? Let me begin with what I believe to be undeniable. The cabin in the woods solution carries inherent assumptions about privilege and practicality that limit its universal applicability. I mean, Thoreau's experiment was possible because he had the financial support of friends, access to land, and the luxury of being a single man without people depending on him. Kinda similar to my scenario. This inevitably raises questions about whether the insights gained from wilderness solitude even deserve to be considered if they're not universally applicable. Apart from the constant maintenance of the fire, there's not a lot more on my schedule. Mostly because this isn't my cabin and it's not my land. If that were the case, there would definitely be a lot more to do. But it's a different kind of busy. It's all about doing things that have real-world implications over perceived ones. If you don't get water, you can't drink. If you don't chop up wood, you're cold. Instead of an endless number of routines and systems to get you to climbing an abstract and completely imaginary social ladder. But what if the whole implication of the question is reframed? Is simplicity only attainable in permanent isolation? I want to believe it isn't. Maybe temporary isolation should be taken into consideration. The romantic notion of a cabin in the woods suggests that physical distance from civilization automatically translates to spiritual and psychological freedom, but I haven't found that to be quite the case, nor did Thoreau. Also, the problem between simplicity versus escapism has also got to be addressed. Does the retreat lead to greater clarity about how to live authentically, or does it become a permanent avoidance of the challenges that define a meaningful existence? With the roaring fire keeping the cabin warm for the night to come, I spent my afternoon reading. Quite appropriately, I must say, Nietzsche's Man Alone with Himself, and at the time I felt like filming and sharing this segment. I personally believe a less romantic view of the cabin in the woods holds a lot of weight. Temporary solitude as a retreat, but not as the end goal, which implies that the answer lies not in the cabin itself, but in developing the capacity for solitude regardless of the situation, learning to apply the teachings of nature, its simplicity in our day-to-day lives, to take the cabin with us, wherever we go. Second morning in the cabin. After cooking some breakfast, I had the feeling I had enough. I had gone into the mountains 3 days ago in a totally different mindset compared to the one I was in now. It felt like time to leave. After gathering firewood and cleaning the cabin as a way to pay respect to it and to those that may come after me, I packed my bags and got on my way.
There's nobody else to blame. It's you, just you. You are so pretty, so polite. Sold me on a Sunday.
I came to that place desperately needing to slow down, and soon enough felt like I was ready to face other important endeavors. Similar to Thoreau's sentiment when leaving his cabin, I left the woods for as good a reason as I went there. Perhaps it seemed to me that I had several more lives to live, and I could not spare any more time for that one. I had not lived there a week before my feet wore a path from my door to the pond side, and though it's 5 or 6 years since I trod it, it's still quite distinct. At the time I'm speaking to you, it's been 8 months since I left the cabin, and I can honestly tell you, the learnings from those few days are still with me today. The path I made is still distinct in my mind, which proves, for me, the cabin is an answer, more than the answer. An answer to certain questions, but not to all of them. You will forever find me returning to my cabin, wherever that may be.
Just you.